My name's Roy William Maega, a lecturer at Makerere University School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Today, we shall be talking about an overview of epidemiological study design. In the first part of this six-part series, we shall look at the epidemiological approach. And this will provide a background to the different epidemiological study designs that we are going to look at in the next series. First, we look at the three-step epidemiological approach. We start by defining epidemiology. Epidemiology is defined as the study of the distribution, not the keywords that are highlighted, a study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events, that is either disease or positive health events or a broad range of health-related events. So it's the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in a specified population and the application of this study to the control of health problems. So we look at the distribution and the determinants of these health-related events, and what we learn from that helps us to apply that knowledge to the control of health problems. Now, we apply epidemiological study designs to assess the distribution and the determinants that we talked about here. So to assess the distribution and the determinants of health-related states, we apply epidemiological study designs. Now, the epidemiologist uses a three-step approach to conduct their work. First, they undertake systematic observation of phenomena to describe the distribution of disease or health-related events for possible abnormal events. So they observe, they look at the population, they observe the population, and they're looking for health-related events and for possible abnormal events occurring, or suspicious events for that matter, occurring in this population. And this domain of observation is what we call descriptive epidemiology. Now, after observing for possible abnormal events and seeing some questionable or suspicious events, they then develop hypotheses. They develop hypotheses about their suspicions between the exposure factors and the determinants of those health-related events. And this comparison is the basis for what we call analytical epidemiology. And thereafter, they can suggest interventions to address the factors that they found to be associated with health-related events. So they can develop interventions, and then they set up experiments. They set up experiments to test the effectiveness of these interventions in addressing the exposure factors that they think are associated with a particular disease. And this is the domain of interventional epidemiology. So they start by observing. The epidemiologists will start by observing. And after observing, they describe. They describe by counting cases or events, determining the denominators, the people at risk, determining rates, ratios, and proportions and risk in the population. And they use this information, that is the cases, the denominators, the rates, ratios, proportions, risks, rates, ratios, proportions, risk, and other parameters, means, medians. They use these to describe the population, and they describe it in three main dimensions. Who is affected? That is in relation to time. When are they affected? That is in relation to place. And where are the people who are affected? that is the person analysis. And then they develop hypotheses, as we said, about the relationship between exposure factors and a particular health-related event, which could be disease or it could be a positive outcome. So they develop hypotheses, and then they compare rates, and they test those hypotheses regarding the relationship between different exposures and disease. And thereafter, they can test interventions, they can identify and test interventions to determine the effectiveness of these interventions in addressing the questionable exposure factors. And then they can implement actions which may include prevention, they can include control, or they can be elimination or eradication of the particular disease. So this first part of these activities of the epidemiologists are in the domain of descriptive epidemiology. That is observation, describing, and developing hypotheses about the relationship between exposure and disease. And then later, the later activities which involve comparison then go into analytical epidemiology. And when they begin to intervene, we talk about interventional epidemiology. So, to conduct the studies that help us to determine these different aspects, these different parameters in epidemiology, we use epidemiological study designs. This is a summary of the different types of epidemiological study designs, and you could use the rule of twos because a lot of it is organized in levels of two. So we have what we call observational studies and experimental studies. These are the broad classifications of epidemiological studies. We have observational studies and experimental studies. Now, within the observational studies, we have what we call descriptive studies, and we have what we call analytical studies. Now, within the descriptive studies, we have different types. We have what we call case reports and case series, cross-sectional studies, in ecological studies. And in analytical studies, we have cohort studies, case control studies, comparative cross-sectional studies, or what we may call analytical cross-sectional studies. And under experimental studies, we have mainly the clinical trials, or what we call randomized control trials, and field trials, or what we call cluster randomized trials. So these are, in summary, a listing of the key types of epidemiological studies. Now, in this series, we are going to look at some of the major types of epidemiological studies and drill down to describe them a little bit more. So for this first part, this is where we will end, and then we move to the next sessions in the series. Thank you very much.